Hello, I'm Andy Pavord, and I'm here to talk to you about the history of the federal budget. Today, we're going to continue our history of the federal budget in 4 acts. Now, there's 4 acts of this project. The first act is how a fear of the fiscal military state and executive tyranny led Congress to use the Constitution as appropriations requirement to limit executive power. That's what we're going to talk about mostly in the next few lectures. But then we'll continue to talk about what happened in the late 19th century when the struggle against social chaos from big unions, the fight over Jim Crow, and the rise of cities led to corrupt political machines and social chaos. But out of that came the idea of the budget. And then in the third act, we'll turn to how the Great Depression led to the budget being used to manage fiscal policies with monetary policy to manage the economy in crisis. And then the fourth act will be about how the budget process fragmented under the pressure of conflicts over government's role in the economy. So today we're going to focus on Act 1, Scene 2, and the focus is on the appropriations, taking it from what happened in the American colonies to the Articles of Confederation. So this video is going to focus on how the rejection of the British military state led to the American Revolution and how the failures of the very limited government of the Articles of Confederation led to the establishment of a new constitution with broad powers to tax and spend. So let's go back to the last videos where we ended there. And we ended with the idea that English fiscal military state, which rose in the 18th century. And in this governing system, the king rules with the consent of parliament. Through a long struggle, which we went through in that video, we talked about how parliament gained the power to control the executive through the appropriations process, through the king having to go to the parliament to raise taxes, and then how parliament put conditions on how those taxes were spent that became the appropriations power. Then we talked about how the stable revenue that this system created, because it turned out that if people consented to taxation, they were more likely to pay it. So this brought unprecedented revenue to the English state. And they were able to use that to leverage that to get even more money by borrowing money. And what this meant is they were able to purchase supplies and maintain a very large and effective army and navy that allowed them to win wars. So they won the 7 Years' War. They won their wars and built an empire that expanded from North America to India, to the islands in the Caribbean. It was an extraordinary empire for a small nation. But that raised problems because now people are getting really, really rich, and rich people can be unruly, and the nobles can be unruly. And so how do you manage that? Well, the first Prime Minister, Walpole, developed the concept of using corruption to get rich people to fall in line, the rich nobles. He basically paid them in Parliament to do his bidding, and therefore he maintained control. So corruption became this central premise, the central method of control for maintaining a social hierarchy. And it's very important to remember that this is a hierarchical society with the king, the nobles, and then the commons. And that was the way society was supposed to be unified in the English system. So what did the Americans think of this? Now, you might have thought that they would have liked it because it was successful. The English system won wars and it made the country rich. But the Americans didn't quite go with that system because they believed in something called the country Whig science of politics. Now, the country Whig position was a minority position in England because most of the English nobility and the people who wrote things and the wealthier commons accepted, in fact, were thrilled with the fiscal military state because it won wars and made people rich. But the Americans rejected this idea. They accepted this theory of equality, the idea that no man should be subordinate to another, because subordination threatened liberty, because liberty could only be something that's shared among equals. And they also believed that power had to be controlled. that power went against liberty. So power needed to be dispersed, not centralized in the corrupt administration of the Prime Minister of England, Walpole. So the Americans were united by a fear of England's fiscal military state. They feared that luxury and corruption would lead to moral degeneration, and they looked back to Rome to see what the fall of the Roman Republic and how the luxury had corrupted the virtues of that had built Rome and caused Rome to turn into a tyranny of the emperor. And the Americans also feared a large standing army because they looked at Roman history and they saw how the Roman army had been the instrument of the emperor and the instrument of suppression of liberty. Now, the religious colonists, and remember, America is a very religious society, also put a religious spin on that, and they viewed corruption as a sin that would incur God's wrath. So for these reasons, the Americans were very, very skeptical of the English fiscal military state, and they viewed it as a threat to their liberty. So this fear manifested differently with different sets of elites. Some elites like John Adams, George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton were angered because they were excluded from the system. You know, John Adams was a young lawyer, very talented, very, very skilled, and believed in himself, and he felt he should be able to be part of the English system. But he was rejected from key jobs because he was just a colonial and didn't have the pedigree of nobility. So he was excluded from the system. And then there's George Washington. He was a war hero, an effective military officer in the French and Indian Wars, who had done extraordinarily brave things. And he wanted to serve in the English army as an officer, but he was rejected because he was a colonial. And then, of course, there's Alexander Hamilton, you know, the bastard immigrant who nevertheless was extraordinarily talented, who was a war hero, who understood finance. And he could not rise in the English system because he was of who his father was. So that these elites, Adams, Washington, and Hamilton, would become the founders of the Federalist Party. They accepted the English fiscal military state, but they wanted to be a part of it. Now, Thomas Jefferson took a totally different view of this. He believed that the English social hierarchy was fundamentally irrational, and it was inconsistent with the Enlightenment values of reason and equality. So he felt that by nature, all white men, because he didn't really conceive that black people could be equal to white people, but he said that all white men should be equal. And he wanted a state to prevent the emergence of inequality. Because remember, in the English system of the fiscal military state, the way you became really, really wealthy is by participation in government corruption. The idea of an entrepreneur building a business and becoming wealthy, that concept didn't exist. And so Thomas Jefferson wanted equality. It meant limiting the size of government. And Jefferson also believed that America's economic power made a strong military unnecessary. Jefferson had the idea that American staples like that were part of the economy, tobacco, shipbuilding, fishes, wood, all these things were essential for European economies. And so therefore, if America was threatened, we could just withhold those products. And we didn't need a military. We didn't need a strong navy. And so for these reasons, Jefferson feared the fiscal military state. But what united all Americans was they fervently believed in Parliament's ability to control the king through the power of appropriations. They felt that the appropriations power is what limited a king and preserved liberty. And so, how did the colonies use appropriations? Well, they used appropriations powers to limit the power of royal governors. They ensured governors never had the funds available to corrupt and manage legislatures. So they made appropriations for very, very specific projects. They would say, we appropriate this specific amount for a specific bridge at a specific location, or another road, or something like that. And for the bureaucracy, they often named the specific individuals and set the exact amount of what their pay would be. So they controlled the revenue, the spending of revenue, in a very tight, in a very controlled manner. But they also took it a step further because they really didn't trust the governors. They established independent auditors to ensure that the governors spent the funds exactly in accordance with appropriations law. Now, as you can imagine, the crown was not happy about this, right? The crown felt that there should be subordination and that the colonies should be subordinate to the royal governors, and the colonies should do as they're told and should give latitude and show deference to the royal governors. And so there was a lot of struggles all throughout the colonies about spending and fights over this. And that was part of what went into the American Revolution. But the American Revolution then grew out of this conflict, and it was triggered by many British provocations, right? There was the attempt to pose taxes through the Stamp Act. There was the aggressive enforcement of trade restrictions, to try to preserve the English monopoly on trade. Americans were limited. And there was the closing of the Western frontier to new settlements. Americans were big-time land speculators, and they wanted to move and take more land. And the British, trying to protect the Indians, the Native Americans, limited Americans from moving to the West. And the Americans didn't like that. So there were the provocations that caused the American Revolution, but there was also an ideological rejection of the corruption of the English fiscal military state that we just talked about. The revolutionaries viewed themselves as virtuous Romans standing up to the corruption of imperial Rome. And they feared that the virtue of equality among white men and the simplicity of manners that rejected luxury would be undermined by the British Empire. And again, it was leavened by the anxiety of an American Jeremiah that looked to an Old Testament-based idea that America must preserve its special role as God's refuge for virtue and godliness. But every American agreed that power could not be trusted and that the English King George's attempts to exert power over the Americans must be rejected. So that sparked the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party, the Lexington and Concord, the campaigns of George Washington, the war that raged for 8 years all over the country. And that war was expensive, right? To stand up an army and fight the British Empire, the most powerful empire in the world, the Americans had to get a lot of money. But they didn't have the money. So what did they do? They went out and borrowed money on a huge scale to finance the war. It was about $160 million Americans borrowed, and they got it all mostly from foreign sources, from like the Dutch bankers in France and Spain. Now, a lot of these loans were motivated by hostility to England from, France and Spain and the Dutch. But they still expected to be repaid, and that will come up later in our story. And then he also borrowed from Americans. So when Washington's army was moving through the country and needed supplies, his quartermaster, Nathaniel Greene, would pay for those supplies with notes, kind of IOUs. He'd write a note saying, for these horses or these wagons or this food, we will pay you so much. And the owners of these notes kept them and expected to be repaid later on. So this added to America's debt. And added to this, the individual states also borrowed money to finance the government during the war and to finance militias. Now, this borrowing worked at the time, right? The American Revolution was able to field an army that won the war. And during the war, there wasn't really a concern because it was like, we got to win the war. Let's go get the money wherever we can. And they didn't worry about it. But after the war, that became a concern. But the war did establish something new and extraordinary in the world, a republic. And a republic was something fundamentally different. South Carolina physician David Ramsey, and this comes from Gordon Wood's amazing book, The Empire of Liberty, noted that Americans The revolution changed Americans from subject to citizens. Now, under the English system, a monarchy requires subjects who fear and honor and patronage and corruption are used to create a hierarchy that holds society together. A republic is something very, very different. A republican of citizens requires virtue and equality. The virtual to sustain the individual independence that prevents corruption. If you're dependent on someone, you can be corrupted. They can have influence on you. The Americans at the end of the revolution believed that that was a threat to the lack of independence was a threat to liberty. And also there was an idea that Americans, at least white men, now remember, it's about white men at this point in our history, that equality would create the affection and benevolence to hold society together, that equals could have sympathy and work together, and that rather than a hierarchy of fear and honor and corruption would be a more solid basis for American society. So a republic would prevent corruption, which is the existential threat to liberty, by limiting the power of executive. And a key part of limiting the power of executive was limiting the power to tax and limiting the power to appropriate funds. Because if a king or an executive has the ability to spend funds how they want, they can corrupt the legislature, they can establish a hierarchy, they can destroy liberty. So the Americans established, they had this fear of liberty. So they took it to a pretty kind of an extreme with the Articles of Confederation, which were adopted in 1777 and were our first constitution, the first American constitution. Now, this Articles of Confederation required the ratification of all 13 states, and that took until March 1st, 1781, when Maryland became the 13th state to ratify the Articles of Confederation. But the key thing about the Articles of Confederation is very strict limitations on the power of Congress, and there was essentially no executive. There was no president. There was no prime minister. There was just Congress. Let's take a little bit of another look at the Articles of Confederation. Look at Article 2. It stated that each state retains its sovereignty. Sovereignty is the ultimate source of power, and the states are the sovereigns in the Articles of Confederation. It retains their sovereignty, their freedom, and independence. So they're not giving up anything to the Articles of Confederation. And every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States, is retained to the states. And so what the Article 3 says what they're created, a firm league of friendship for common defense, security of liberties, and mutual and general welfare. And they bind themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made by them for whatever reason. So this is not like the current United States Constitution. This is very different. And then when it came to financing, it had very strict limitations. First of all, it says Congress shall never engage in war, nor grant letters of marque or reprisals without specific agreement, nor borrow money on the credit of the United States, nor appropriate money. So there's a limitation on both borrowing and appropriation, unless 9 states agree to it. So that it is very hard to appropriate, to spend money, and it's very hard to borrow money because you need 9 states. And then now the Articles of Confederation had very serious issues, right? First of all, and this is very, very important, it was unable to pay off the debt from the Revolution. This was a big, big deal because remember, from the English fiscal military state, the key to England's power was the ability to borrow money. And if you're a country that can't borrow money, you can't wage war, and you can't protect your country against the great European powers. So the lack of a strong state that could borrow money and build an army meant that America is getting pushed around by the European powers. the British wouldn't live up to the peace treaty. They wouldn't pull their troops out of Michigan. And then the Mississippi River was shut off, which was incredibly important to the people who lived in the West, by Spain. So we're not a powerful country. We can't be safe in the world. And that was a problem with the Articles of Confederation. But there was also a fear that the Articles of Confederation could not overcome the factionalism and incompetence of state legislatures. Because you could never get 9 states to agree on much of anything, right? And then the states are out of control. They're issuing too much money. They're badly managed. I mean, one of the most important influences on our United States Constitution is that James Madison felt that state governments were incompetent. He believed that he had been in the Virginia General Assembly, and he felt it was massively failure, that the bills were written, and there became a fear of factionalism. And there became a fear that actually we've always been scared of the executive, but with shades of rebellion, a new fear emerges, that maybe it's the majority, maybe it's the passions of the people out of control, worried about their own selfish interests, that is the threat. And so you had Shays' Rebellion, and that scared everybody. So they decided to go to rebuild the Constitution. Almost every political leader realized that something must be done to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. So James Madison and others persuaded Congress to call for a constitutional convention. Now, most Americans expected the convention to modify the Articles of Confederation to include a limited authority to tax, because they wanted to be able to face down these foreign threats, to build a military that was capable of that. And they also wanted a power to regulate commerce so that commerce among the states would flow. But that was about the limit of what most people expected out of the Constitutional Convention. But the Constitutional Convention produced something very, very, very different. It produced a strong national government with very broad powers to tax and spend. And that is what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about how it was submitted to in the next video. We're going to talk about it was submitted to the states for ratification, and about how the Constitution established the power to tax, the power to limit, the power to spend, and limited that power to spend by the requirement for appropriations. So just a quick, and that ends the discussion for today, for this video. I just wanted to show a couple of selected references, and I will tell you that if you want these slides for your use, and you can use them any way you want, they're available on LinkedIn, on my LinkedIn page, and also on the page of the American Association for Budget and Program Analysis. That's a group I'm president of, and our mission is to expand knowledge of the budget, among other things we try to do. And so we will post these slides. And so that concludes this presentation, and I hope you join me in the next presentation as we carry the story forward to the Constitution of the United States.